Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Generous Futures event titled Destigmatizing Mental Health. My name is Clara Tam, and I'm the Director of Student Integrated Health and Wellbeing at Toronto Metropolitan University. Thank you for joining, and we are very excited about this panel today, and we can't wait to dive into the discussion. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm delighted to be moderating this Generous Futures event today, and especially on the tails of Mental Health Week. I would like to start and take this opportunity to thank our lead sponsor of the series, TD Bank Group, for helping to advance these important discussions. TD Bank Group has been a great supporter of Toronto Metropolitan University, and we are delighted that they have joined us on this journey of understanding. Today, we are looking at stigma and equity issues within mental health. We'll explore how we can challenge this stigma so that we can move towards greater understanding and acceptance. Also, we will have an opportunity to unpack how social determinants of health impact access and resourcing for mental health supports. For today's session, I will be posing questions to the panel, and following this, time permitting, I will be asking our panelists to respond to questions that were submitted by some of you when you registered. Now, I am delighted to introduce you to our panel of leaders today. First up, we have Sanjay Singhal. Sanjay, there he is, who is a proud Canadian tech entrepreneur and author, best known for founding and selling audiobooks.com. He created the 500 Startups Canada Fund and co-founded 6 companies and is actively an ongoing investor in over 20 startups. Recently, Sanjay made a transformational philanthropic investment in psychedelic psychotherapy research to treat mental health disorders, including anorexia, depression, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Welcome, Sanjay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Next, we welcome Margaret Eden, who is the national, there she is. Hi, Margaret, who is the national CEO of the Canadian Mental Health Association, the most extensive and established community mental health organization in the country. Prior to joining CMHA, Margaret served for 7 years as Executive Director of the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council and as President of ABC Life Literacy, and held leadership roles within the Association of Canadian Publishers and Magazines Canada. Welcome, Margaret.
Thanks so much for having me.
Last but not least, Nzinga Walker. Nzinga? There you are. Nzinga is the Executive Director of Stella's Place, which provides collaborative and innovative mental health services to young adults. Known for her effective leadership, she is working with her team to ensure that young adults and their families receive effective services while upholding values in inclusivity, diversity, equity, and accessibility. Nzinga brings an anti-oppressive lens to her work and values meaningful practices that integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of her work as a mental health professional and social justice advocate. Welcome, Nzinga.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining us. We're very excited to have this amazing panel share with us today.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start our discussion by asking the same question to each of you. Sanjay, perhaps we could start with you and then followed by Margaret and then Nzinga in terms of response. So the question is, why is this topic so important to discuss now? Sanjay?
All right, thanks, Clara. I think we've all seen a rising tide, perhaps created by COVID, perhaps created by life evolution of people suffering from mental health disorders, primarily depression. We're seeing teen suicides up, a general malaise across the population. But that's combined with the availability of treatments now that are coming out that have historically not been available. So we don't want to go into a pill prescribing frenzy, but there's lots of things we can do now, especially with therapy and coupled with novel approaches. And so it's time to actually take this bull by the horns.
Thank you. Let's turn to you, Margaret.
Well, like Sanjay, I also see the impact of the pandemic. The CMHA has been doing research over the last 2 years to look at what is the impact of the pandemic on Canadians. And we found that almost 40% of Canadians have said that their mental health has been worsened by the pandemic. And we've seen a huge spike in things like suicidal ideation. But at the same time, I would also say, I feel like this is a time of real opportunity because, as Sanjay said, many people have experienced these mental health challenges. And I feel like there's more compassion. There's more of an understanding of what it is like to walk with depression and anxiety in particular than we've ever seen before. And that creates real opportunity for systems change, for the possibility that people could get access to the care that they need when they haven't historically been able to access it because of the patchwork quilt of the systems that exist right now in mental health.
And then your thoughts on this, Nzinga?
Yes, and just to add to Shanzay and Margaret's comment, when we look at how mental health has been impacting the young adult population, we have seen where it has significantly increased. And so, when you look at the whole topic about why is that important at this point, it's important because mental health is an important aspect of wellness. And so we need to engage in these conversations because it is crucial to ensuring that we are at our totality when we have good mental health.
Thank you so much for these opening thoughts. We're going to dig into this a little bit. We now have some tailored questions to ask each of you. And perhaps we'll go in the same order. So I'll start with Sanjay, followed by Margaret, and then wrapping up with Nzinga. 2 rounds of questions. So Sanjay, starting with you, you established the Nikian Foundation in 2019 with the end goal being to promote the efficacy of psychedelics globally and to provide clinical facilities, training, and accessibility to the general public. Can you tell us more about the groundbreaking work that the Nikian Foundation is doing and also why you decided to champion mental health?
Happy to, Clara. So one of the things I'm going to talk about, and probably part of the answer of all the questions that are asked today, is going to be that to destigmatize mental health, we need to talk about it. And I suffer from bipolar disorder 1 that was diagnosed when I was 30, but because of the stigma surrounding the manic depressive term, I refused to acknowledge it, didn't get on the right medication for many years. And when I finally did at age 38, my life suddenly got a lot better. And I realized that I really need to talk about it more. And I've been very open ever since with having this disorder myself. And my daughter, who's 26 right now, and is a student at, resident in psychiatry at University of Toronto, has had struggles with an eating disorder. And she's also become open to talking about it as opposed to like brushing it aside. And I think for all of us, talking about these disorders, when I tell people that I have a bipolar disorder, probably 7 times out of 10, the response I get is, oh my gosh, I suffer from depression, or I also have a bipolar disorder. It really is something that affects nearly all of us in some way, form, or another. So the reason I founded Nikian, the Nikian Foundation, is we were trying to find a treatment for anorexia. And I had heard at a conference that researcher Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial University in London thought that psilocybin, the ingredient behind magic mushrooms, might work to treat anorexia. Went over there, met with his research team, and discovered that it's not just eating disorders, that psychedelics broadly can treat a variety of mental disorders, from anxiety to PTSD to treatment-resistant depression. And a lot more work could be done here, but because these drugs are all illegal for really bad historical reasons, philanthropy has to fill the gap because there's going to be no public funding for these drugs as recently as 3 years ago. And now we're seeing a renaissance in this because philanthropists came forward, funded the initial research, have shown efficacy, and now we're moving on to a new phase of this. So we've been historically a research foundation, and we're moving into becoming a storytelling foundation to help people share their stories of disorders and treatment and what they've done to get past it.
Thank you for that. I'm really excited to hear more about it, hopefully sometime today. Switching over to Margaret, her question is, what are some of the most significant mental health challenges facing Canadians? How do social determinants of health and other factors impact access and resourcing in Canada?
Well, first, I'd like to thank Sanjay for sharing your story and being so open. And I do think that is the way that we're going to reduce stigma, is to have more people talk about their real lived experience. I walk with depression and anxiety, something that I found really spiked, especially my anxiety during the pandemic. And as Sanjay was saying, that is one of the big challenges that we've seen. We've seen this rise in depression. We've seen a rise in the use of antidepressants. Eating disorders, especially amongst the young, are at near record levels. And the incidence of substance use has increased dramatically. And we believe that that's related to mental health challenges through the pandemic. So what we saw through the pandemic was a tremendous number of people reaching out, trying to get help, and waiting lists grew and grew. So it could take, in some cases in Ontario, for example, people were waiting 18 months to get mental health care for children and youth. It was a very difficult time. But what our concern is that those wait lists will continue to grow. So even as the impact of the pandemic perhaps wanes a little bit, people get back to work, back to school. What we've seen from other natural disasters like the Fort McMurray fire, we found there, even 2 years after people had returned to their homes, they were still coming to the CMHA looking for help for mental health care. So the pandemic may be somewhat resolved, but we're still going to see that impact on people for longer. And our research showed that when people reached out for help, 17% said that they couldn't find the help that they needed. A bunch of people didn't know where to look. In some cases, there were no services available. And many people said that they couldn't afford it or it wasn't covered by their health insurance. So what we see then is people coming to the CMHA for free service, not being able to find it, people who can't afford to pay, lining up and waiting for substance use treatment or access to a psychologist or psychotherapist. So we really don't have a system in Canada where we have universal mental health care. If you had a broken arm, you'd go to emergency and get care. If you have depression or you feel you have a mood disorder, it's hard to know exactly where to go to get support and care for that. And as you mentioned, the social determinants are hugely important. When we think of those social determinants, we think about income, housing, employment, and access to those things. Housing became a huge issue for some of our clients across the country. And at some of our CMHAs, in fact, they were providing tents to some of the clients and offering them maps to Crown land so that they could find a place to live after they had lost housing supports. When we look at the CERB program, this was the $2,000 that the federal government provided each month for people who are unemployed during the pandemic. We saw that as a mental health program. Because fundamentally, if you don't have housing and if you don't have an income, you are going to have a mental health issue as a result. So what is the solution for all of this? Well, we believe that we should have universal mental health care and that our federal government and provincial governments should be seeing mental health as a human right, something that we all need access to, not just the care and support for the mental health condition, but access to those social determinants of mental health as well. And we see a future for that. For the very first time, we have a federal minister for mental health and addiction, which gives us great hope. And the work that Sanjay is doing, looking at new treatment, is incredibly exciting as we think about actually addressing root causes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Margaret. Nzinga, I want to turn to you. Stella's Place provides innovative mental health services to young adults. What are some of the mental health challenges facing young adults? Many that we know are student-aged. How can we better support these groups?
Yeah, young adults are faced with a wide range of mental health challenges, and we certainly have seen how that have intensified in the past 2 years since we have encountered the pandemic. For young people, this has been quite challenging because they're at an age when you socialize the most in your lifestyle. And that's the time that people are being told, they need to stay home, and we need to stay home because there was, in fact, reason for us to be confined. But for young adult, that really was more challenging for that demographic. Also, you look at, situation where they may have been doing learning by online learning. We also look at young people just not being able to afford living in the Toronto region anymore. And so these are really a lot of external stressors that can impact individual ability to function effectively, which in turn will transition into mental health challenges. If people don't have good connection to their technology so they can remain in school, or they may not be able to navigate the system very effectively, those are stressors that eventually can cause anxiety, that lead to depression and the other even more serious mental health challenges. Part of what I do think, as we beginning to look at how we can better support young people, I think we need to beginning to engage them in the treatment that we're designing for them. My experience is that young people really know what they're experiencing, and they really can articulate what is working best for them. I think a lot of time we sort of get caught into creating programs for adults, and then we extending those to young adults. And so that doesn't work. And so one thing that we do at Stella Space is what we call a co-design model. And so before we can offer any program, those programs need to be co-designed with the individuals who are going to be receiving those services. And so the co-design process is not just about asking for consultation. It is actually a process where we go back and forth with the participant to decide and determine which of these models will work best for them. And so we've seen that transition into our program being widely attended and our retention rate being really high. So I think we really need to be consulting young people when we are looking at developing program and services for them, because I do think when the model suit what they're looking for, they will actively participate in the process.
Thank you, Nzinga. That particularly resonates, particularly in my role here at the university. So I'm really going to look into some of those lessons and learnings. Thank you. Switching it back and coming back to Sanjay. Sanjay, your question: as a tech entrepreneur, what role does the tech industry play in advancing mental health support or research?
I am so glad you asked that question, Clara. So, because I've been wrestling with this myself, we've been like writing checks to research organizations, but that really hasn't been taking advantage of my own background in technology and the availability of platforms to educate people in how to address mental health concerns. So we've changed the foundation from being focused on research to focusing on storytelling. And we're going to be creating a new platform at nikn.org. It should go live tomorrow, where we're collecting people's stories on their treatment of a mental disorder having a positive transformational experience using psychedelics. Because these drugs, and we're talking about MDMA and psilocybin, LSD, can be dangerous. Like any drug, when misused, can be dangerous without proper knowledge of how they should be used and prep and follow up. And by telling stories of people who've used these drugs properly for treatment, we're going to help propagate, just the general idea that, hey, a lot of good can be done here, but also how to do it properly. And so, the number one thing that people miss out when they're using these drugs is the follow-up, what we call integration. So you can have these amazing experiences and insight and speaking to your ancestors or to your younger self, but if you don't sit down 3 days later and talk about this with a therapist or write down for yourself how this impacts you and what you're going to change in your life, you've got a window after you take these drugs of how long you can easily make changes based on your realizations. And we need to make sure people take advantage of that window. And all our stories will focus on that: proper preparation, proper dosing, proper set and setting, and then proper integration afterwards. And we're excited. Our mission is to tell 1 million stories. And we're going to start actively collecting them. And when we talk to people about their mental health concerns and how they've treated them, they get so excited when we say, and we're going to sit down and interview you and collect your story. Some of it will be via Zoom, a platform like this. Some of it will be more professionally done. I'm creating a documentary right now called Ordinary Trip, of what happens when people who don't have a DSM-5 psychiatric diagnosis of a mental disorder, what happens when they take psychedelics to help improve their lives. And what we're seeing is a lot of undiagnosed psychological conditions start coming up when people are just getting through the day, getting through their lives. They don't have time to go in and be diagnosed with a bipolar disorder or with depression, because they're just trying to survive. But these drugs can help everyone, and we're going to be telling stories using a technology platform to enable them to learn more and then feel better about telling their stories and sharing.
Thank you, Sanjay. Looking forward to the launch of the website tomorrow, you said?
The website's there now.
Okay.
But the storytelling component, being able to register to tell your story, will go live probably later today or tomorrow.
Great. From tech to arts. Margaret, in addition to your role within the CMHA, you have also been a leader in the arts community. Do you see a connection between the arts and mental health? And are there ways in which we can leverage the arts to better support mental health and challenge stigmas?
Thank you so much for asking this question. I love it. I was thinking back to when I was working for Tafel Music Baroque Orchestra, and I got a letter from a subscriber that said, coming to Tafel Music is better than Prozac. And I thought that was just great. That idea, you come to a concert, it's quiet and dark, and the music washes over you, and it can be something that really supports and sustains your mental health. And I found during the pandemic, I missed one of my favorite activities, which was going to the Bad Dog Theater, which is improvisational comedy. And I would describe it as being like an internal massage. I would go and laugh for an hour, and I felt tremendous release and happiness from that experience. And I really missed it during the pandemic. And I was just chatting with the chair of the board of Bad Dog, who said he took a class during the pandemic. They were offering improv classes by Zoom, and that was important for his mental health. So I think especially the creation of art and being engaged, and not just as an audience member, but as someone who could sit down and draw or paint or take an improv class. Coloring books have become so popular of late. I think that immersion in an activity that uses maybe a different part of your brain than you would normally use can be really an important part of a mindfulness practice. And I think we saw that through the pandemic as well. Many people reaching out to do different things, making music, being creative in other ways, as ways to stimulate themselves, take themselves out of their own worry, and focus on something else that was important to their mental wellness. So I think absolutely, if art speaks to you, then it absolutely is a great ingredient. Don't give up your antidepressant prescription right away, but it can be a useful thing in addition to other practices.
Thanks, Margaret. I think about, is bread making an art?
I think it's a craft. Yeah. Arts and crafts. Exactly. All that sourdough bread people were making, very restful, really good for mental health.
Amazing. Nzinga, I'm going to switch it over to you. Can you please tell us more about the importance of integrating equity, diversity, reconciliation, and inclusion when working to destigmatize mental health? What are some of the factors that impact mental health and access to resources?
I would say destigmatizing mental health is all of the above. And so, it's important that when we speak about reconciliation, we, especially in the context of Canada, we're really taking a look at the formation of how this country was structured. And so you start with even as early as slavery in this country and the confinement of Indigenous people, and be able to recognize that those legacies still exist today and how it impact generation after, and those structures that were constructed to create system to have particular outcomes still exist. And so it's important for us as we are delivering services that we recognize these and recognize that we have to take those into consideration when we are responding to people with different diversity coming in for mental health support and care. When we look at social determinants of health, we can identify inequity in our policy system that is oppressive and impact personal right and success of individual, and making sure that these things are barrier free. Particular communities have higher rates of unemployment, and so that in itself create stressors and inequity in those communities. And so what we see sometimes happen is that services aren't always there's always a gap for services. I don't think there's anywhere today where you don't have to go on a wait list. And so oftentimes people may have to turn to family or community to get that support. And so for people who really are struggling from a marginalized perspective, when you have to take on those added responsibilities, it can be quite challenging for communities. And yet that's the only thing that they can deal with at this point. But we must recognize that if we have a goal to implement social justice, then we must acknowledge the differential approach within our structure and recognize that within the whole issue of trying to address the mental health challenges is that there is inequity within those structure. And so we have to have those lens as we try to support people adequately so that they can get the service that is going to best respond to their needs.
Thanks, Nzinga. I feel like we could dig into a whole panel discussion on just the topic around equity, diversity, reconciliation, as well as even arts and tech and all the well-being practices. So thank you all for sharing those thoughts at this time. As mentioned at the start, we received some excellent questions from the audience when all of you registered. So I'm going to pull some of them now to ask our panel. And so at this time, I invite any of the panelists to respond. Feel free to jump in and share your thoughts. So looking here, so our first question, we kind of highlighted right at the beginning that there's been some significant impacts with the pandemic. So with all the urgent needs in our communities brought on by the pandemic, how can we ensure that our attention on mental health continues to grow?
I can jump in on this one. We're in an election right now in Ontario. So I would urge you to take a look at the platforms of the different parties and consider how they support mental health right now. If we want more access and care, we're going to need more investment. And it's been very interesting to see each of the parties has an actual platform on mental health, something that hasn't happened in the past. So I urge you to vote for the party that you believe will best support mental health care in the future.
Thanks, Margaret. Sanjay, did you want to?
I think we in my area of psychedelics, we're almost have a fortunate circumstance going on where we have a set of treatment options that have a lot of commercial activity happening behind them. So we have a solution that's going to go out there seeking a problem, and it just happens that that problem is one that's burgeoning right now and needs a lot of attention. And so it's a happy confluence as opposed to trying to create a problem that we can sell into. We're coming up with a solution just in time. So I'm hopeful that continues. We're in a bit of a wane right now in terms of the commercial interest in it, but it's going to pop up again as soon as, right now the FDA is completing, an organization called MAPS in the US is completing a second phase 3 trial to demonstrate efficacy of PTSD being treated with MDMA. And once that completes towards the end of 2023, you're going to see an enormous amount of attention coming in, because this is going to be the legalization of ecstasy and the regulation of it, which is what should have been done 40 years ago when it was made illegal. And as a result of that, you're going to see a tremendous amount of attention on what these drugs can do.
Thanks, Andrea. Nzinga?
Yeah, I just think one of the things that, in addition to all that has been said, I think it's important for us to be able to be measuring the impact of services that we are delivering, and create new evaluation criteria so that, truly respond to the presented needs that individuals are presenting, and engage participants who are receiving service to make sure they're not just attending services, but they're actually benefiting from it. I do think it's very important for us to keep this topic on the agenda. Mental illness impact every one of us, and I think we need to make this a continuous dialogue, not just for the election, but post the election, and continue to raise the issue. I don't think we have seen the true effect of the pandemic. We're just touching the surface. And I really think that this needs to be a topic that continues to be not just discussed, but there need to be adequate investment from government in ensuring that Canadians maintain their wellness as a society.
Thank you all. Maybe spinning off that a little bit and looking more into our own role, I'm going to merge a couple of questions here. So the question is, what role do all of us play in destigmatizing mental health? And what is one thing that we can implement either in our personal or work lives that would make a significant impact on changing the perspective of mental health for the better?
Oh, I can address this one. The one thing we can do is talk about it. And, the comment was made earlier that if you're suffering from some sort of a mental disorder, people don't know where to turn. And it's actually kind of appalling that you can't, first of all, most young people don't have access to a family doctor. So you can't even go to your family doctor. But at least if you start talking about this with friends, colleagues, parents, loved ones, then they may be able to offer some insight. Like, there's ways to get treatment now with psychedelics. Fortunately, we live in Canada that is a little bit more drug tolerant than our neighbors to the south. There's ways to get treatment now that as a Canadian charitable foundation, I can't refer you directly. But if you were to start conversations with people about, hey, do you know how this treatment might work or how it might access it? There's lots of people out there who'll talk to you about it. So I encourage everyone, just talk, ask people to help you solve your problem, and there'll be a lot of people that'll leap forward.
Thank you. Talking.
I would just say, try not to be using destigmatizing languages. These are simple things that the everyday person can be doing, but really encouraging individual to come forward. I mean, even in terms of mothers who, after childbirth, there's so many women who struggle with depression and, postpartum, and many of them feel fearful in speaking openly about what they were experiencing. So they suffer in silence, right? And so as a society, we need to be more receptive to the fact that people don't cause mental illness on themselves, so they shouldn't be blamed. But also as a society, I really want us to stop criminalizing people who are exhibiting mental health issues. There have been some recent cases where it's really clear that these people are struggling with mental health challenges. And, you see the way in which the language is being used as if, they're very bad people. And I'm like, no, let's as a society really beginning to look and recognize when someone is unwell and treat it that way, and be able to respond to people knowing that in that moment they're not totally in control of the things that they're doing. So we, as a society, we also need to do that, because when we respond to people those ways, then other people will feel more open and safe to come forward and speak about what they themselves may be experiencing.
So good, Nazinga. And I just wanted to advocate for listening. It's so important to talk, and it's so important to listen. And one of the things we always advise is, instead of saying, how are you, say, no, really, how are you? Try to get the other person to share their honest feeling, and not just brush it off and say, oh, I'm fine. But if we can start talking about how we're really feeling and investigating our own feelings, I think that will go a long way towards destigmatization and creating a safe space for people to actually express that they are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add there, I had an interesting situation develop at the foundation where we're open to talking about how people are really feeling. And I had a colleague of mine say that she was suffering some anxiety because some things going on in her life. And I gave her some space and stopped inviting her to certain meetings, because I thought, okay, let's give you some space, deal with this. And she interpreted that as I was marginalizing her because I thought because of her anxiety, she couldn't deal with the issues that were going on, so that was not what I was trying to do, but I should have asked. And so as part of listening, I should have asked her, how would you like to be supported through this? Instead of just reacting however it felt like reacting. So I totally agree, Margaret. Listening is every bit as important, and we need to ask how people want to be helped.
Thank you. And it's a little bit of a cycle here, the talking with the listening, with the destigmatization. It all impacts. So thank you all for sharing that. We're putting the tides together here now. Another question from the audience. How much of stigma has intersectionality with other determinants of health, such as low income, race, or other areas? And I know this has been spoken about throughout our discussion already, but perhaps we can dig into this a little bit more.
Sorry, Claire, I'm not sure I understand what the actual question is.
So the question is, how much of stigma is tied or comes crosses paths with other determinants of health? So there's low income, race, gender.
I think there is a lot of crossover, but it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. If you have an intractable mental illness, it can be stigmatizing to the point where you have difficulty holding a job. You have difficulty staying in a house, maintaining rent. And so oftentimes, because we have so many people with untreated mental illness, they're not getting the care that they need, and they're not getting the social determinants of health either. And so then they become further stigmatized and can also end up in conflict with the law. So we need more generosity and compassion, and we need more actual supports and services. We strongly believe in housing first, which is the belief that if you have an intractable mental illness, housing is the start. You need to get housing, and unless you have housing, you're not going to get the other kinds of care that you need. You're not going to be able to be employed. You're not going to be able to deal with your substance use, or to even make sure that you stay properly medicated or in touch with your caregivers. So these things are all deeply interconnected and intersectional. And we know too that racialized people also tend to have because of racism, mental challenges and mental health concerns that the white population would not experience. So yeah, these things are deeply interrelated.
Mm.
And just to touch on what Margaret just said too, just in even terms of, housing even determine you getting access to social assistance, and so we even need to critically look at the amount of income that people receive on social assistance. There are individuals for very good reason who are unable to maintain employment. And so to have people living on such meager income really create added stressors to individual. And we see, where the food bank continues to tell us that not only do we see individuals who are on social assistance accessing the food bank, but also people who's earning a living and is unable to cover the cost of their food because those income goes first towards trying to have a roof over their head. And so, we need to have a society that really beginning to say, it's not just about myself, and if I'm okay, I'm okay. We really need to come in really beginning to look at wellness as a community and wanting to see individual within that community are okay. And again, making these issues, something that government need to be responding to. People are experiencing stressors in their daily life. And we see that with not just racialized people, but we also see that with young people because they have very limited control. Oftentimes, when you're looking at the younger children, or even teens, they may be getting support from parents. For young adults, this is when they're venturing out in their independence. And so for them, it becomes even more challenging for them to be able to sustain themselves from an economic point of view. And so that stressor of not being able to succeed really drive people into depression and anxiety. And unfortunately, some succumb to suicide because of those, because of what they experience with mental health challenges.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to switch it a little bit and go into a different type of question that came from the audience. So the question is, some argue that there are some generations that think difficult times make strong people. Strong people build an easier life, and an easier life creates comfort. Comfort creates weak people, and weak people create difficult times. It's quite the question. For them, it gets more challenging to accept that mental health is real. How can they destigmatize mental health if they don't believe in weakness?
That's a little bit funny, but it is a true question. And I thought I'm at the tipping of that generational conversation because I do come from a generation that would think that yes, you got to be tough. But the truth is, many of our parents themselves weren't doing well. Right. And so what we consider doing well is that we retain our job, we retain some amount of normality. But it's clear that there were indications of anxiety and stressors. And so the children tend to have it more intensified than the parents themselves. But we also need to be real that, what our parents endure in terms of stress is nothing in comparison to what we're seeing right now, and so I think we need to be really more supportive with our younger generation because they're functioning in a very extremely high stressful world. That's true. And it doesn't help that, we have access to social media 24/7. And so people sometimes are unable to separate themselves from the pieces that are that are creating those mental health stressors for them. In terms of the parents and the language, I think our young people does a very, very good job of articulating what they're feeling. I think from my experience, what I see is the younger generation will say, I feel tired too every day, but I still get up and I go to work. And so what I'm hearing from our younger generation is they're able to say, yes, I feel tired, but I'm feeling tired because, you know, I experienced this or this. And so they're able to make link oftentimes with what they're experiencing with some, you know, whether it's depression or whether it's a circumstance that occur in their life that caused them to feel that way. And I do think, you know, we just need to continue that type of dialogue. The older generation may get it, but they may not, but that's okay. It's important that as we move forward, that we're really creating these brave spaces where we can continue to have those discussions.
Thank you, Linda.
Yeah, you know, there's this notion. I remember when I thought of myself as having depression as opposed to a bipolar disorder, I got a lot of people saying, snap out of it, you know, show some willpower, just, you know, pull it together, go to work. There's lots of evidence in the social sciences now, and based on, you know, physiological research, that there's no such thing as willpower, right? If you feel like getting up, you'll feel like, then you'll actually get up. And all the people who believe that, you know, a mental disorder is a sign of weakness are the ones who don't actually have a mental disorder, right? They're just looking down at other people. And so listening with an open mind, having people in positions of power talk about their mental disorders is going to gradually walk us towards destigmatization. We're almost, in a sense, lucky that, or a positive aspect of the broadening impact of mental disorders now is that so many people are having them, and that as they talk about them, it's automatically destigmatizing. It's like, so it's not really a small portion of society anymore.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's so true. We've even started to reframe how we talk about mental health and mental wellness, where, you know, we used to focus a lot on the 20% of Canadians, the 1 in 5, that in any year would experience a mental illness. And now we talk about the 5 in 5, that we all have mental health, and we all have something that's worth preserving. And it could be any one of us who either becomes mentally ill, suffers a mental health challenge, or has a family member or friend who experiences a mental health challenge. So in that way, we try to destigmatize the notion of mental health by reminding everybody, you know, we all have a body, we all have a brain, you know, health doesn't end at the neck. All of these things are true, and hopefully that older generation will understand that there can be, as Sanjay says, you know, these biological determinants of mental health that none of us have control over. It's the brain we were born with, and we all have to learn how to manage it. And many of us walk with that management of our brains every day. So I hope with time we will get to that point where 100% of us understand the value of mental health and its support and preservation.
And probably attached to this around the destigmatization, something that comes up is kind of destigmatizing your own self-stigma. So maybe following up. So there are, like, I think many people harbor self-stigma when it comes to their own mental health. So are there any suggestions for how someone could combat or fight the stigma that they hold for themselves or they hold within themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly had this in spades, thinking, I don't want to tell people I'm crazy, because part of me believed that I was crazy. And I mean, being depressed left me a lot of time just lying in bed reading books. And it was astonishing as I read more and more about the nature of depression, how many people suffered from it. And for me, it was liberating finding out that so many inventors and leaders in history suffered from various mental disorders, and just made me feel better. It's like, okay, maybe I'm still crazy, but at least I can be a productive member of society and still accomplish all the things that I want to accomplish. And so disseminating that information is really important.
Yeah, I had that similar experience. I remember listening to Prozac, which was an early book that came out talking about the new SSRIs, and chatting with my doctor about going on an SSRI. And he said, well, if you were diabetic, I'd get you a drug for that. So why wouldn't I write you a prescription for an antidepressant? So just that kind of openness to have that conversation helped me overcome some of the self-stigma of, is it just me and am I the only one? And why do I need extra help? Why don't I just have willpower? And so, I think this larger conversation that we're all having is really helping. Even this conversation today, I think helps destigmatize.
And I do, for some individual, I do encourage them to have a therapist that you can help to connect with about those self-thought, because sometimes, it's a little bit challenging for you to sort of talk yourself out of it. And so a therapist is a household name these days. It doesn't, everyone uses a therapist, and so just to be able to connect and have somebody walk you through those thoughts is very beneficial.
Yeah, we've actually seen the emergence now that, as Nazinga says, talk therapy is no longer stigmatized, right? It's like, yeah, I see a couples counselor, I see a therapist once a month, just, for my mental health. It's not there's something wrong with me. It's just, hey, to keep things at the level that I want them to be at. I also wanted to mention, just because I was looking across my desk and I thought I'm remiss in not mentioning this book, there's the growing movement in psychiatry and psychology these days that, and in fact, sorry, the notion that there's something wrong with your brain that's making you have a mental disorder has actually been discredited. It's not a chemical imbalance. It's not that you have too much serotonin, not enough dopamine or something like this. In the vast overwhelming majority of cases, there's actually something wrong. Like there's something wrong with your life that is situational, that's putting you into a depressive state. And this book is called Lost Connections by Johan Hari. Talks about 7 different types of connection to the natural world, connection to others around you, connection to yourself and childhood trauma. And being disconnected from these things leads you naturally to a sense of not being supported and feeling, we're humans, we're social creatures. Being disconnected makes us less productive as humans, and getting reconnected is a way of treating these mental disorders. Again, talking is the #1 way you can get connected to the world around you.
Thanks, Sanjay. We will be sending out some resources after this to everyone that's attended, and so we'll make sure to include that, because I could see good sense everyone sort of writing it down very quickly as you were flashing the book. So I'm just getting a cue that we are transitioning to the final thoughts. So I'd like to wrap up this discussion today by asking for final thoughts from each of you. And to all of you, if there is one thing you'd like to leave our audience with today, what would it be? One thing, one thought, one paragraph?
So I'll start. It's the thought I would leave is, if you feel that you're suffering from a mental disorder or lack of mental health, the thought I would leave you with is there's nothing wrong with you, right? But there might be something wrong with your situation. And the best way to find out is to open yourself up, talk to other people about the problem.
Thank you, Sanjay. Margaret?
I too encourage you to reach out for help, with the cautionary note that sometimes that might be hard, and that you might end up on a waiting list, and that we do need to invest more in mental health care. But unless you reach out and ask, you won't get on that waiting list. You won't find that person who could help or make that connection. And I encourage you to reach out to your local CMHA to find supports. And I guess I just wish everybody out there the best mental health possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Nazinga?
Yeah, I always say an investment in our young adult mental health is an investment in Canada. It's can't give you a better return. And I just want to encourage our young people to reach out, seek that support. You're not alone. And I know sometimes you may try a service and it doesn't necessarily seem to be what you're looking for, but don't give up, just keep trying. And I will encourage young people particularly to express what you are looking for. And so there are many agencies who will adopt when they're able to hear from client how the service is impacting them. So please participate in evaluation and speak openly. If you don't like the service, don't feel pressure to say, people did good. It doesn't impact you receiving service again. If it was crappy, let us know, because that's the only way we can improve the services that we provide to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay, Margaret, and Azinga for being a part of this panel today. Thank you for your thoughts, wisdom, and discussion. I know that I speak for everyone in showing our appreciation from hearing from all of you today. A huge thank you again to our lead sponsor of the Generous Futures panel series, TD Bank Group. Your leadership is truly commendable. Thank you as well to our promotional partners, the Association of Fundraising Professionals Greater Toronto Chapter, Canadian Association of Gift Planners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and Community Foundations of Canada. Thank you to all of you, to our audience, for joining us today. Please expect an email in your inbox in the coming days with a link to the recording of this discussion. Please feel free to share it to all of your networks. We hope you will join us on May 31st for our next Generous Futures event, which is titled Anti-Semitism Online. Details about this webinar will accompany the email you receive in your inbox. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take good care and stay safe.